In this video, we uncover 5 brutal bear attacks, from a man who thought he could outmatch a captive black bear in Georgia to a woman who believed calm intentions would protect her from a grizzly sow. But first, we're going to start with a starving polar bear who brutally attacks a girl because of one dumb decision she made. It was August 14th, 2016, and the sky over Longyearbyen, Svalbard, sat under the endless Arctic summer light. The tundra, the gravel roads, and the distant glaciers stayed visible in a washed-out, shadowless glow. Cassandra Lee was 22 years old and had traveled to Svalbard during a gap year following her undergraduate degree in media communications. She had been documenting the trip on social media from the moment she landed, building content around every excursion the group took. Her fellow group members later described her as someone who had been documenting the trip heavily on social media. Longyearbyen is the main settlement in the Svalbard archipelago and operates under strict wildlife safety laws. Every person who travels beyond the marked boundary is required to carry a high-powered rifle or travel with a licensed armed guide. Warning signs at the perimeter are posted in 4 languages. The message is the same in every format. You are now leaving the settlement safety zone. Firearms required beyond this point. Cassandra had arrived 3 days earlier with a guided ecotourism group of 11. The licensed guide, Eric, had delivered the boundary rules on the first morning with specific clarity. He told them that the Svalbard archipelago supports a significant polar bear population within the Greater Barents Sea region, that bears had been found inside the settlement in previous seasons, and that the Arctic in summer has a way of feeling safer than it is because the light never fully disappears. He explained that this feeling was an illusion. He made every member of the group sign an acknowledgement form before the first excursion. For 2 days, Cassandra complied. She filmed from inside the settlement, from guided hikes, from the deck of a boat tour on the fjord. But she also complained openly that the restrictions were overkill. She told another member of the group that the town felt like a controlled bubble built for tourists who are scared of their own shadows. On the 3rd evening, during a group dinner at the guest house, Cassandra had an argument with her closest friend in the group. The dispute centered on the fact that the friend had developed a romantic interest in someone Cassandra had quietly liked since the group first met. The argument ended unresolved. Cassandra pushed back her chair, left the table, and went upstairs without speaking to anyone else. At around 11:30 that night, while the rest of the group was asleep or in the common room, Cassandra put on her jacket, laced her boots, and strapped on her headlamp out of habit. Though the Arctic summer light made it unnecessary, she walked out of the guest house alone without notifying anyone. She brought out her phone to start filming what she will upload to her social media later that day. What Cassandra did not know was that a large male polar bear, weighing approximately 900 to 1,000 pounds, had been reported earlier that week, several miles north of town. While sightings are logged and patrols increased when bears are nearby, the vast terrain surrounding Longyearbyen makes constant visual tracking impossible. Polar bears near Longyearbyen in late summer are often in a significant caloric deficit because the sea ice they rely on for seal hunting has retreated. They are drawn toward settlements by smell and will cover long distances at night without hesitation. Polar bears are one of the only bear species that actively stalk humans as prey, and they can travel silently for long distances despite weighing over 1,000 pounds. Their paw pads are covered in small dermal bumps called papillae that function like built-in traction on ice, allowing them to move with surprising quiet. The bear detected her before she ever saw it. When a polar bear has identified a person as potential prey, it may approach quietly and directly, sometimes without vocalization or visible warning signs. The attack was not a defensive charge. Cassandra, who had stopped filming and was walking slowly in the direction of the lights, was struck from behind without any time to turn or react. The first contact was a strike to her upper back that drove her face first into the ground. She lost the phone on impact. The bear made direct biting contact with the back of her neck and shoulder region. The encounter lasted only a short period before responders arrived. A settlement safety worker driving an ATV spotted movement beyond the boundary and radioed for assistance. He unslung his rifle and drove toward the location. The bear was still present and had to be driven back with a warning shot before emergency responders could reach her. Paramedics and the settlement emergency team arrived on scene within 12 minutes. Cassandra was alive, but in critical condition with severe injuries to her upper body, neck, and left arm. She was transported by ATV to a hospital for emergency stabilization. Given the severity of her injuries, a medical evacuation helicopter was requested from Tromsø on the Norwegian mainland. The helicopter required several hours to reach the Norwegian mainland. She died before it could arrive. The cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries from a polar bear attack resulting in uncontrolled hemorrhage. The polar bear was located and euthanized the following day. Eric was cleared of all responsibility following a full safety review. While Cassandra Lee's final moments were shaped by circumstance and the unforgiving cold of the Norwegian Arctic, what unfolded in the hills of northern Georgia was shaped by something else entirely. It was May 18th, 2014, at a privately licensed wildlife sanctuary in Lumpkin County, Georgia. In the central bear habitat, a 340-pound American black bear named Atlas paced along the interior fence line. Derek Paulson was 29 years old and had driven to the sanctuary that Sunday with his girlfriend of 3 weeks. During the drive, he had already begun boasting about his nerve, about how most people were too soft to really experience anything, about how fences and warning signs were designed for the fearful. He viewed the visit partly as a stage, and he had already decided he would not leave it without a story worth telling. The sanctuary operated on 42 acres approximately 90 miles north of Atlanta and was licensed under federal wildlife facility regulations. The bear enclosure was constructed of heavy-gauge chain-link fencing approximately 8 feet high with an inward-angled overhang at the top. It was built decades earlier under older standards and grandfathered in under updated regulations. Warning placards were mounted at regular intervals. Do not enter. Active bear habitat. Stay behind barrier at all times. Black bears rely heavily on rapid, explosive swats rather than prolonged mauling, and a single forepaw strike can generate enough force to break large bones. They can sprint up to 30 to 35 miles per hour over short distances. Atlas had no history of aggression toward staff, but no unfamiliar person had ever entered his enclosure. At the start of the tour, the guide, Dana, clearly stated that the railing and fence marked a strict boundary, and that climbing or crossing either barrier was prohibited. Derek initially remained behind the railing, though he spent most of that time making dismissive remarks under his breath, calling the warnings excessive, saying the bear looked practically tame. When his girlfriend quietly suggested they simply watch, he stiffened. He had something to prove. When Dana rounded a bend in the path with several visitors, momentarily obscured by a stand of trees and the shifting cluster of guests, Derek stepped over the secondary railing. He gripped a vertical support post beside the chain-link panel and began climbing, using the post for leverage. The outward angled extension, which projected roughly 18 inches inward, forced him to hook an elbow over the top rail and shift his weight carefully before swinging a leg past the angled section. After reaching the top, he swung a leg over and dropped down inside the enclosure. The bear was approximately 30 feet away when he registered movement within the habitat. He turned toward Derek, head lowered, ears angled back, and released a sharp huff before taking several stiff-legged steps forward that quickly escalated into a short, accelerating charge. Derek turned back toward the fence, but did not have time to climb. The first contact was a forceful forepaw strike that caught him across the left shoulder and upper back, knocking him to the ground. He fell hard and struck the side of his head against the packed substrate. The bear approached immediately and bit into the upper portion of his left shoulder while he was prone. The bite was forceful, accompanied by a brief shaking motion before the bear released and repositioned. Outside the enclosure, his girlfriend began shouting. Dana initiated the emergency protocol and ordered visitors to clear the fence line. A staff member triggered a compressed air horn mounted near the habitat. The horn sounded repeatedly rather than once. After several blasts, Atlas released his grip and moved away at a fast walk toward the opposite side of the enclosure. The entire physical interaction lasted under a minute, though subsequent review indicated it felt longer to witnesses. Staff secured the perimeter and prevented further intrusion. Emergency services from Dahlonega arrived shortly. Derek had sustained deep lacerations and puncture wounds to his left shoulder and upper back, along with significant head trauma from the fall. He was conscious but disoriented during initial assessment. He was transported to a medical center. Surgery was performed that evening to repair vascular injury in his shoulder region and to address a subdural hematoma caused by the impact. Over the next 24 hours, neurological swelling increased despite surgical intervention, and his responsiveness steadily declined. He died on May 20th, 2 days after the incident. Investigators determined that the enclosure met construction standards and that the breach resulted from deliberate visitor misconduct, though they recommended increasing the standoff distance as an added precaution. Tours were temporarily suspended during the investigation before the facility reopened. Derek Paulson had climbed a fence to prove something to the people watching. What happened to Rachel Summers in the Canadian Rockies required no audience at all. It was September 3rd, 2015, and the temperature at a national park, Alberta, had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit by 10 in the evening. The Bow River Valley lay below the ridge, and somewhere beyond the tree line, as wildlife frequently moves through the broader Bow Valley corridor, something large was moving. Rachel Summers was 34 years old and worked as a graphic designer in Calgary, Alberta. She had driven to Banff for a long weekend camping trip with 2 colleagues from her office. She was typically organized, but on this trip she decided a short walk to the bear locker wasn't worth the cold. The national park manages a closely monitored population of grizzly bears within the Canadian Rockies. The park posts food storage regulations at the entrance kiosk, at the registration booth, and on laminated cards at every campsite. The rule is simple. All food, cooking equipment, and scented items including toiletries must be stored in the designated metal bear-proof lockers at each site or locked inside a vehicle. The regulation exists because a bear that finds food near humans becomes food-conditioned, and a food-conditioned bear returns with increasing boldness until it eventually has to be destroyed. The group arrived on September 2nd and received the food storage briefing from a warden at the kiosk, who mentioned specifically that a grizzly had been flagged as active in the campground corridor that week. Rachel's 2 companions followed the rules each evening, placing their food and toiletries in the steel locker before going to sleep. Rachel did not. On both the first and second nights, she kept a bag of granola bars, a sleeve of crackers, and a container of trail mix inside her sleeping bag. She also kept a lip balm and a travel-size hand lotion inside her tent bag. Both carry scent that a grizzly can detect at considerable distance. A wildlife camera on the adjacent trail had recorded the sub-adult male grizzly, approximately 4 years old and 280 pounds, ranging the campground perimeter on 6 of the previous 14 nights. A grizzly's sense of smell is estimated to be 7 times stronger than a bloodhound's, and can detect food from over a mile away, even through packaging. Food-conditioned bears lose their natural avoidance behavior and approach camps with increasing boldness. He had been flagged 3 weeks earlier as food-conditioned after raiding an unsecured cooler at a nearby picnic area. He had been getting closer every time. By the night of September 3rd, the bear had shown increasing boldness around developed areas compared to earlier sightings. On the 3rd night, Rachel's colleagues went to bed around 10:30. Rachel fell asleep with the food bag alongside her in the sleeping bag, as she had the 2 previous nights. At some point between 1 and 2 in the morning, the grizzly entered the campsite. After moving along the perimeter of the campsite and pausing intermittently, he approached the tent, drawn by the concentrated scent from inside. He pushed his nose along the base of the tent wall, working slowly around the perimeter until he found the strongest concentration near the foot of the sleeping bag. Then, he bit and pulled. The first tear opened the rainfly and a section of the inner wall simultaneously. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet campground. Rachel woke immediately. She sat upright, and the cold air hit her. The beam of her headlamp, which she had left within reach, was knocked sideways and lit up the collapsed side of the tent. The bear's head was already partially through the torn section. She screamed. The bear reacted to the sudden movement and noise. He lunged forward into the tent and bit down on her right forearm, which she had raised instinctively in front of her face. The bite was deep through the muscle. He then pulled back, tearing the sleeping bag and pulling Rachel partly against the opening of the tent. Her right shoulder caught the tent frame on the way out and wrenched hard. She ended up on the cold ground outside the tent, face up. It was Rachel's colleagues who broke the standoff. They had woken to the screaming, and both began shouting at full volume from inside their tents. The bear paused over her briefly, head low and breathing heavily, then shifted attention toward the shouting from the other tents. He then moved back across the campsite toward the tree line. Several minutes later, a warden's truck arrived with headlights and a bear banger, and the Grizzly disappeared into the forest at the eastern edge of the campground. Wardens reached Rachel at 1:52 in the morning. She had serious lacerations to her right forearm and shoulder, and blunt trauma to her upper body. She was transported to a hospital and underwent surgery that morning. In the days that followed, despite repeated surgical debridement and broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics, widespread muscle devitalization and contamination led to a rapidly advancing necrotizing infection. Her condition deteriorated into septic shock. She died 6 days after the attack. The investigation concluded that unsecured food and scented products inside her tent were a primary contributing factor in the bear's approach. The Grizzly was located the following afternoon and euthanized. Rachel Summers had not gone looking for danger. She had simply decided that the rules were inconvenient. Hundreds of miles south, in the wide-open valley of Wyoming, someone else was about to make a different kind of miscalculation. It was July 9th, 2017, and the mid-morning temperature in a park in Wyoming, Idaho, had already reached 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The valley stretched wide and golden under the summer sky, the grass moving in a low wind, and the distant ridgelines shimmering in the heat. A bison herd grazed near the creek. Further out in the meadow, partially obscured by tall grass, a grizzly bear was feeding steadily. Several cars had already pulled into the roadside viewing area. Margaret Elaine Doss was 58 years old and had retired the previous year from a career in human resources management in Scottsdale, Arizona. She had come to the park with her husband as part of a 2-week road trip through the national parks. He would later describe her as someone with a deep, genuine affection for animals who believed that animals could sense a person's calm intentions. She had volunteered at an animal shelter in Scottsdale for years and had told her husband before the trip that she wanted to come home with better wildlife photographs than the ones from her previous visit to that same park 15 years earlier. The Lamar Valley is one of the most productive wildlife watching locations in North America. The National Park Service requires all visitors to maintain at least 100 yards from bears and wolves and 25 yards from all other large wildlife. These are federal legal requirements. Rangers patrol the valley throughout the day. A ranger vehicle was parked at the far end of the pullout when Margaret and her husband arrived. Margaret had a digital camera with a moderate zoom lens and felt the distance was producing images that were too small. She told her husband the bear looked completely calm and that she only wanted to move closer for a better angle. He told her clearly not to. She waited several minutes while the ranger at the far end of the pullout was speaking with another visitor and scanning the meadow through binoculars. The ranger had noticed intermittent movement in the grass that suggested the possibility of a cub, but had not yet confirmed it before Margaret stepped off the road. Margaret stepped off the road shoulder and into the meadow grass, moving slowly and deliberately, the way she moved around nervous dogs at the shelter. She moved more than 100 yards from the road, well inside the required safety distance. The sow's posture changed first. Her head came up sharply, her ears angled back. She gave a short, forceful woof and rocked forward a step. What Margaret did not fully grasp in that moment was that she was now within close range of a mother bear that likely had a cub bedded in the grass between them. At that distance, especially if a cub was nearby, a direct human approach is commonly interpreted as a defensive threat. Mother grizzlies account for a significant portion of serious bear attacks in North America because they respond instantly to perceived threats near cubs. The bear surged forward. The charge showed no prolonged hesitation, typical of some bluff displays. It was fast and direct. She covered the distance in a few seconds. Margaret turned when she heard the sudden rush through the grass and saw the movement in her peripheral vision. She attempted to run, but managed only a step or two before the bear reached her. At the far end of the pullout, the ranger shouted and ran toward the road edge, bringing up the launcher he had already been holding after noticing possible cub movement in the grass. The charge detonated between the sow and the road edge, but she was already within striking distance. As the sow veered, Her right forepaw struck Margaret across the upper back and shoulder in a powerful swiping motion. The impact knocked Margaret forward into the grass. She fell hard and remained face down, stunned. The bear hovered for a brief second over her, huffing sharply, then pivoted away, returning quickly to the area where the cub was concealed. She positioned herself between the cub and the road and did not re-engage. The ranger reached Margaret within moments and called for the medical unit. The wound extended from Margaret's left shoulder blade toward her lower back in a deep, ragged tear that disrupted multiple layers of muscle and included puncture wounds consistent with a brief bite, introducing significant contamination into the underlying tissue. She was conscious but disoriented and showing signs of shock. A park medical unit arrived within minutes. She was stabilized on scene, transported by ground ambulance to Mammoth Hot Springs for transfer, and then airlifted to a medical center in Idaho Falls. She underwent surgery that afternoon for wound cleaning, tissue repair, and aggressive debridement. She initially responded well to treatment. Over the next 2 days, however, extensive devitalized tissue and contamination from the wound led to complications requiring additional surgical debridement. Despite intravenous antibiotics and additional surgical intervention, she developed a severe systemic infection. Her condition deteriorated, and she died on July 13th from septic shock related to the traumatic injuries. The authorities referenced the incident in updated visitor safety messaging at the park entry stations the following season. One woman walked toward danger, believing it would not respond. A few months back, the other never had the chance to walk away. It was August 27th, 2016, and a hiking party of 4 had left a trailhead in a national forest in a remote county in Wyoming at 6:30 in the morning. The air at 9,400 feet was cold and clear, the kind of early mountain morning that feels like the day is on your side. It was not going to stay that way. Stephen Merritt was 45 years old and lived in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he worked as a high school biology teacher. He had been making backcountry trips in Wyoming and Colorado for over 15 years and considered himself an experienced and prepared wilderness traveler. His pack for the trip was well assembled and included a first aid kit, an emergency thermal blanket, a water filter, a backup headlamp, and a satellite communicator. Before leaving home, however, he had made one specific decision. He was not going to carry bear spray. He told the 3 friends he was hiking with that it was extra weight, that he had never encountered a bear at close range in 15 years, and that the odds were low enough to skip it. One of his companions, a man named Joel, carried his own canister. The other 2 did not. The mountain range covers over 1,000 square miles of remote alpine terrain across western Wyoming, with no cell service and limited radio range once a hiker is more than a few miles in. The National Forest website, the trailhead kiosk, and the local ranger station all carry the same advisory: carry bear spray and know how to use it. The ranger at the local office had told the group the previous afternoon that grizzly activity had been elevated along the Upper Lake corridor that summer due to increased late-season bear movement through alpine basins. The group's plan was a 3-day loop of approximately 26 miles through the Upper Lake Basin. The first day passed without incident. On the second day, they continued north into the Upper Basin. By mid-afternoon, they had entered a wide alpine meadow with scattered white bark pine groves at the upper edge. The trees were heavy with cone crop. In late August, grizzly bears focused almost entirely on food. It will often not register an approaching hiker, but it will respond to a sudden close-range surprise without hesitation. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Stephen was hiking about 30 feet ahead of the rest of the group when he rounded a large granite boulder at the tree line and found himself within 20 feet of a large male grizzly, estimated at between 450 and 500 pounds. The bear was standing on its hind legs against a white bark pine, focused on cone clusters above. He dropped down the moment he registered Stephen, and they were face to face at 20 feet. There was a single second of stillness. The bear charged. He covered the distance in roughly a second. Stephen had no time to retreat, and the boulder to his right limited movement. Joel, 30 feet behind, cleared the boulder and saw the situation instantly. He drew his canister, aimed, and discharged it in a forward arc. The cloud of capsaicin reached the bear's face at close range and struck him as he lunged. He broke sharply to the left, swiping at the air, eyes and nose already reacting. But in the fraction of a second before the spray fully diverted him, he had already made forceful contact. His right forepaw struck Stephen across his right forearm with enough force to fracture the radius and severely damage the ulna. In the same motion, his jaws clamped onto Stephen's upper right shoulder, crushing through muscle and causing deep puncture wounds before the spray drove him off. The bear crashed into the brush and did not return. The entire contact lasted only a few seconds. The group activated Stephen's satellite communicator within 60 seconds. Stephen was conscious, but in severe pain, and the shoulder wound was deep with visible muscle damage, while the forearm was visibly deformed and bleeding heavily through the torn sleeve of his jacket. The group applied continuous direct pressure, immobilized the arm as best they could, and treated him for shock using supplies from the first aid kit. A search and rescue response was initiated through the local county system. A civilian medical helicopter reached the group's coordinates at 5:40 in the afternoon, approximately 3.5 hours after the attack. Stephen was transported to a regional medical center in Wyoming. He underwent emergency surgery that evening. Surgeons repaired vascular damage in the shoulder, debrided extensive crushed muscle tissue, stabilized the forearm fractures with internal fixation. Surgeons noted extensive crush injury with vascular compromise that had reduced tissue perfusion prior to arrival. He required multiple additional debridement procedures over the following days to remove devitalized tissue. On the second day post-surgery, he developed acute compartment syndrome in his right forearm due to swelling from the crush injury, requiring emergency fasciotomy. Despite aggressive surgical management, high-dose intravenous antibiotics, and intensive care support, he developed septic shock with multi-organ failure, secondary to the extensive crush injury, and contaminated bite wounds to his shoulder. His condition deteriorated over the following days in the intensive care unit, and he died 5 days after the attack. The authorities issued a formal incident report documenting the circumstances of the encounter, including that bear spray had been available near the trailhead, that the group had been advised to carry it, and that the single canister deployed had been sufficient to stop the attack before it escalated further. The Grizzly was not located despite an aerial search, and was not considered a candidate for removal because the behavior was consistent with a defensive surprise encounter. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.